Okay, welcome to the Introduction to Sustainability lesson. Okay, so the first part of this lesson, we're going to go over energy and sustainability. Some key questions to think about here. Why is society dependent upon energy, and what does it have to do with sustainability? Why is energy important for society? What is per capita energy use, and why is it important? What is resiliency? Okay, so think about these questions as we go through the content. So the first portion here, I'm going to discuss a reading from Asher Miller, and is the introduction to the post-carbon reader, which you see on your screen here. A lot of these readings are actually available online for free. I use some of them in this course, but you're welcome to find the website. There's a post-carbon website, and you can download a lot of the readings. And so in this reading, it's an introduction to sustainability in general, but also the relationship between energy and sustainability. And so I want you to press pause and read this for a minute and tell me what you think, or not tell me what you think. Think about what it means, okay? So there's a couple important things here, and I've highlighted a few of them. One, he says that we have awakened to find the bills for this energy bonanza have come due. So with the energy bonanza, what he's referring to is this basically over the last 200 years or so, starting with around the Industrial Revolution, where we started really using a lot of energy. And I'll show you some charts here in a minute what I mean. But we really started using a whole lot of energy. We had this bonanza. So a bonanza is like a whole bunch of something. And we have had access to a lot of energy over the past 200 or so years, particularly fossil fuels. We have oil and coal, and then oil, and then natural gas. Okay, and again, I'll show you a chart here, but basically we have this huge bonanza in energy, and we kind of went on this huge explosion of activity, human population, consumption, economic activity, environmental destruction. And so he characterizes this as an industrial binge, which he's referring to basically the industrialization of the Western world. So we started developing factories, mass producing goods, building cars, then building planes, and so forth. But what he's trying to put into context here is that we've had this huge bonanza, this major availability of energy, and we went on this industrial binge. We started building a bunch of things and growing the population, growing cities, and so forth. But what he's saying here is that we're reaching this point in time, and this book was written around 2010. We're reaching this point in time where this, what he calls the bills have come due. So we've gone through this binge, excuse me, and now we're realizing that there's some impacts of this binge that we're dealing with now: climate change, water and food scarcity, biodiversity, habitat loss, social and economic injustice, and so forth. And his point here is that this lifestyle that we've established, particularly in Western countries, based on having access to a bunch of energy and producing a bunch of goods and growing population and so forth. There's all of these issues that we've really come to realize now are really becoming a problem, to the point that we believe that we cannot sustain it anymore. And that kind of summarizes in some ways the purpose of the course, and that is to kind of go through the reasons why we think we can't sustain what we've been doing. Okay. So hopefully you've had a chance to watch the video. There's a video that's posted on the course website that is narrated by Richard Heinberg, who also writes for the Post-Carbon Reader. It's a nice little 5-minute jaunt through the history of fossil fuel use in the U.S. in particular, but also in the world. And so, without getting into too much detail here, you can watch the video. There's some very important aspects of modern life driven by fossil fuels. So if you want to press pause and think about how fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas are influenced or related to the things that you do in your everyday life, go ahead and think about that. And so, there's a lot of things here. Transportation, okay, so obviously most of you, I'm sure, drive a car that uses gas, okay, so gasoline is a byproduct of oil. Farming is really dependent on fossil fuels, whether it's for the machinery or producing plastic. Anything that's made of plastic, by the way, is oil and or natural gas. So everything around you is there's plastic in the screen you're looking at right now. I guarantee has some plastic in it. We've used it to wage war, manufacture goods. The economy itself is largely based on fossil fuels, globalization. There's all these aspects of modern life that are dependent upon fossil fuels, okay? Some of them good, some of them not so good. But the point is that there's also these other impacts that have come sort of lockstep with these. events, including climate change, environmental destruction, the fact that fossil fuels are not renewable. And he said we must live within nature's budget of renewable resources at rates of natural replenishment. And we'll dig into that phrase a little bit more, or at least the intent of that phrase. Okay, and so his point here is that basically we've established this society largely based on fossil fuels, which have done a lot of really good things for people. But we're reaching a point where we've noticed that there's a lot of negative impacts that have happened as a result of this, and we need to start preparing for what he calls business as unusual. In other words, we need to think about what it's going to be like when fossil fuels are more scarce, or when it's becomes so dangerous to use them, or so the impacts are so negative that we have to stop using them as much, and we have to prepare for that world. And his whole premise here is that this post-carbon world, this world after using these carbon-based resources, coal, oil, natural gas, it's going to happen eventually. And so do we plan for that, or do we keep on going on, doing the things that we've been doing for so long with the assumption that fossil fuels will always be there? And that's a really important part of sustainability, and a term, something we call resiliency, and that is, can we continue to do the things that we're doing for an indefinite period of time? So this goes back to a previous lesson. And that's a really important consideration in terms of energy use. Okay, so let's just look. You don't really have to dig into this chart too much, but this is a chart of the price of oil, okay, since 1861. So right after the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania. Okay, and really what I want you to pay attention to is the orange line. So this orange line, and I'm tracing it with my cursor, the orange line is the price of oil, the price of a barrel of oil adjusted for inflation. So you can think of that as the price it would cost in today's money. So on the y-axis here, this is $20 a barrel, $40 a barrel, $60, up to $100 a barrel. And then here we go from 1861 all the way to 2006. And so I want you to take a look at this chart, and you go ahead and press pause and think about anything that jumps out at you in this chart, any trends, any sudden jumps, anything like that. So go ahead and press pause and think about it. And what you notice is that oil is discovered, the price spikes dramatically, okay? Then it kind of goes down, goes up. There's a little bit, a lot of volatility at the beginning, and then this is right around 1880 or so. The price was about $20 a barrel, and with a few blips aside, okay, generally speaking, even, you look at World War II, the price of oil actually dropped during World War II. Okay, so we had this about 1880 to about 1973. We had really, really inexpensive oil. Okay, so you had $20 a barrel, really cheap oil. And if you can think about 1880, this is right after the Civil War. Think about what the U.S. looked like at that time, horse and buggies, not really big cities. Cars were barely around. Air travel wasn't even possible at that point in time, at least mechanical air travel. And so this whole period of time, then you go to the 70s, the 70s, interstate highway system, international travel is not a big deal, huge cities, a lot of development. So this is, in this approximate 100-year span, we had a lot of really cheap oil. And the whole point is that, the first point is that modern society, to a large extent, is built on cheap fossil fuels. So this period of time is when we really developed as a society, as a Western society in particular. Okay, so we go from horse and buggy to muscle cars in the span of less than 100 years, and all that time we're developing cities. We're had a couple of wars. We're building factories. We're growing population. So this is where the U.S. and the Western world in particular really modernized over this period of time, and it coincides with really inexpensive oil. Okay, so that's one thing, that modern society is really built on cheap fossil fuels. Another, and as Asher Miller points out, he says, look around you and you'll see the very fabric of our lives was woven with cheap, abundant energy. So he says those days are over. As it turns out, they may not be over. We have more access to fossil fuels than we did before. But the point is that if everything, fossil fuels are really essential and woven into just about everything we do. Okay. Now there's a couple of other things you might have noticed. So we had this long period of relatively inexpensive oil, but then there's a big jump here, big jump here. So this is 1973, this is 1979. And these are what are known as the global oil shocks. And so these were both wars in the Middle East, both Arab countries in, invading Israel, basically. No, that's actually not true. Excuse me. This first one is Arab countries invading Israel in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, and then this one is when the Iranian Revolution happened. So the thing to know about this is that we are used to having really cheap oil, really cheap gas. We build our society based on that. And guess what happens in a matter of a couple of months? The price basically tripled, okay? And then it didn't drop much, and then about doubled in another course of a few months. And so can you imagine very sudden, very huge increase in the price of oil, gas, and consequently food, everything, the price goes up. And so these were called oil shocks is because it was a shock to the system. So we have the system that's built on cheap oil, and all of a sudden it's really expensive. And so it became really difficult. They were rationing gas. People couldn't afford food. They couldn't afford to get place to place. So it really impacted the economy, really impacted society. And so that's the other thing to consider is that oil is a very volatile commodity. And so if we're really dependent upon oil, it follows that when prices shoot up really quickly, we're really have trouble in society. And that happened again. A lot of you might remember this in the early 2000s with the Iraq War and then Katrina. Again, the price spiked. And it really just causes a lot of chaos. And from a sustainability perspective, that's a problem because when oil becomes more expensive or scarce, our society suffers. And we can't continue to depend on oil so heavily because eventually the oil is not going to be around most likely. Okay, and just to give you a snapshot of the difference in 100 years makes. So this is Times Square in 1900, and then the exact same view in 2000. Okay, so this is just one example. I mean, the image on your right is practically glowing with energy, right? So in only this short period of time, remember, for most of that time, oil was really, really cheap, and it was really essential to development. And then this chart is on the x-axis here. This is the amount of energy used per person. Each of these dots is a country, okay, across the world. And then this on the y-axis, we'll go over this in more detail later. This is what's called the Human Development Index, okay, HDI. Think of it as a measure of how well a country is doing, how well its people are doing, okay? And so go ahead and press pause and think about what this chart tells you about the relationship between energy use per person and human development. And really, there's two really clear trends here. First of all, at a very low level of energy, okay, between the 0 and 2 here, you notice if you're really low on this energy scale, most countries are in a relatively low state of development, okay, below 0.6 or so. But if you can just increase, as you increase to about, let's say, 2 tons of oil equivalent per person. So once you reach this point, you go on anywhere above 2, and almost everybody, every country on average is pretty well developed. Okay, so the first trend that's important to note in terms of sustainability is that you probably need at least a minimum amount of energy to establish a good quality of life for your people, and that's pretty well known in the field. But the second thing to note is if you kind of look where my cursor is right now and look to the right of it, what do you notice about the trend in terms of human development as you move to the right here? Now, hopefully you notice it's pretty flat. Okay, it's really flat. And so the other story is, at a certain point, if you use more energy, so you move over to the right on this scale, as you use more energy, you tend to not really get more developed or add any additional development. And so that's the other impact for sustainability. The one is you probably need at least the minimum amount of energy to become a pretty, well-run society, a well-developed society. But there's also a point at which more energy doesn't necessarily mean more development. And that's important to keep in mind, okay? And just to give you an idea, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this chart just shows you the red line is, so this is from about 1500 to about 2000. The red line is total energy use, okay? The blue line is the population growth. This is global. And the green line is energy use per person. The whole point here is that energy use has skyrocketed, right? Population has grown pretty significantly, but the energy use has really skyrocketed over the past couple hundred years. And another snapshot, this is energy use from 1775, so right around the Industrial Revolution, okay, until today. Oh, and sorry, one more thing I did want to point out in this slide is that the Industrial Revolution started late 1700s, right? And so it was very soon after the Industrial Revolution that we really started to increase our energy use, okay? And so that's when that whole industrial period, the industrial binge, as Miller calls it. And so the Industrial Revolution is generally pointed to the point at which modern society really started to develop. Okay, now back to this chart. This is just different energy sources. The yellow line's coal. You have oil in black. You have natural gas in blue, and then hydro and some other renewables and nuclear here. Again, the main point here is starting right around the mid to late 1800s, we really started using an awful lot of energy, and it's only grown since then. Just another chart that shows you the world energy consumption by type. This is the bottom section is basically oil. This is basically coal. This is natural gas, renewables, and nuclear. The whole point here is to show you that almost all, so these three sections here are all fossil fuels. Okay, so we're highly, highly dependent on fossil fuels. Okay, and again, another important thing to point about this chart is this is after 2013, right about here, it's all projection. So if you look at, we've been growing energy use over time, and we're going to continue to grow use. If you look at any legitimate prediction of energy use, it tells you that we're going to actually continue to increase our energy use. Okay, so these are two interesting charts. One thing to point out, so this is total energy use over time, okay? So in the world energy consumption over time. So we're looking at from the 1960s to today. The bottom section here is the OECD countries. So OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Really all you need to know is that OECD means the sort of wealthier countries in the world, okay? So this is all the wealthier countries, and this is the lower income countries. Now if you look at the projection of the total energy use, you'll notice that the lower income countries in the world are projected to have more of an increase in energy use moving forward than the wealthier countries. We've kind of already reached our limit here. This shows population through time. Okay, again, we have our wealthier countries on the bottom and the lower income countries on the top. And another thing you'll probably notice here is that the population is much, much bigger in lower income countries, and it's projected to grow, whereas wealthier countries basically are going to level off and already are to a large degree leveling off in terms of population. And so you want to kind of think about putting these two charts together. You think, wow, these lower income folks across the world are really starting to hog a lot of the energy. They're growing a lot. The population is huge. And so a lot of times, usually when you hear the term overpopulation, they're referring to lower income countries in the world. But I want you to think about in terms of sustainability and resource use that it's really important to look at the per capita energy use. Okay, so again, this is the year moving forward, and this is the energy per person. Okay, so higher energy per person as you move up. And what you may notice, is that the OECD, the wealthier countries, are up here, the lower income countries are down here. And so the point here is that even though the lower income countries in the world, generally speaking, are growing faster, the population is growing faster, and they're using more energy than the higher income countries, on a per person or per capita basis, wealthier countries in the world, generally speaking, are using, let's say 4 to 5 times as much energy as the average person in a lower income country. So it's important to think about when we look at overpopulation, using a lot of energy, we want to think about who's actually using most of the resources. That turns out people in wealthier countries are really using resources at a lot higher rate than people in lower income countries in the world. Okay, and so it's kind of a synopsis here, what this has to do with sustainability. So remember, energy is essential to society and development. Some energy sources are limited, some will run out, so that's a really important consideration when we look at these oil shocks and so forth. When we have a society that's highly dependent on these sources that will eventually run out. And as you saw in the video and in the reading, there's a lot of problems that are being caused by using all these non-renewable energy sources. Also, the per capita resource use is important to consider. Okay, so the last few concepts from Asher Miller. And I'm not going to dwell on these because we will talk about these a lot later. So he notes that we have hit limits to growth, so we have to start to adapt to these resource constraints. Okay, so really think about the fact that we have to limit our growth. We need to address issues not in isolation. Okay, so we need to realize that the world is an interconnected place, and if we're going to address sustainability, we need to address more than just the issue itself. We have to recognize that everything's connected. I'm not really going to go over this one. Focusing on responses, not solutions, not as helpful. He says we must prepare for uncertainty, and so this is the notion of resiliency. And so resiliency, I'll go over in a little more detail in a minute, but we need his premise, and a lot of people are advocating for this, that something bad is going to happen, whether it's an economic collapse, resource scarcity, water scarcity, a war, whatever. So bad things do happen. They're going to happen again. We don't know when they're going to happen, but in order to be a more sustainable society, we need to be prepared for that eventuality. Okay. And also, I think it's really important to consider, and Miller says this in as much as possible throughout this course. I'll try to promote this, and that is that we can do something, that you actually can help make the changes that will establish a more sustainable society. Okay, so just a couple more key terms. So resilience is something that's important to keep in mind. So resilience is the ability to manage unforeseen shocks while maintaining their essential identity. So basically, you can think about resilience in any number of ways. I mean, if you're a resilient person, something bad happens to you and you kind of bounce back. Well, the same thing can be said for a city, a town, even a person in terms of sustainability. So if the price of oil spikes, are we ready for that? If the price of food spikes all of a sudden and then we can't get our, avocado shipped in from Argentina, are we okay? If we can't get our food shipped, across the country from farms out in Colorado, are we able to support ourselves locally? So these shocks are going to happen. The question is, if the question is, are you resilient? The point is that if bad things do happen, can you survive? Can you continue to kind of live the way you live? Now, maybe you're going to change things a little bit, but can you structure your way of life, your society in such a way that you can withstand these shocks to the system? Okay, now systems-oriented approach, systems-oriented thinking, just basically that means we need to look at things as a system. So recognize that the earth is a system, society is a system, that we can't just address the economy without addressing politics or the environment. Everything's interconnected, so we need to think in terms of the system and how it all works. And that's closely related to interdisciplinary. And interdisciplinary just refers to we need to approach these problems with a variety of perspectives and expertise. Okay, so a couple more things here with Asher Miller. Really heavy statement here. He's saying, we have these numerous crises are converging simultaneously. They're interdependent and affect virtually every living thing on the planet. And this I find really a heavy statement, but I want to hear what your reaction, or I want you to think about your reaction to this statement. The success or failure of the human experiment may well be judged how we manage the next 10 to 20 years. So this is really, it's tough, I think, to think this way, but a lot of people in the sustainability field are concerned that this is the case, that this is sort of this critical moment in history where the actions that we take, the policies that we enact, the things that we do, the way our society, changes or doesn't, may really be the key to the future of human society. I know it sounds really heavy, but I do think that there are a lot of signs pointing to the fact that a combination of these factors related to sustainability indicate that this is a really, really important time in human history. So hopefully you'll keep that with you as we go throughout the course.